There are forces of good and forces of evil at work in the world today. What are these forces? Who is responsible for the good? And who is responsible for the evil? Richard Schaff talks about current events which are rarely discussed by the mainstream media, events that affect us all. This program seeks to identify, to inform, and to equip the believer for what's ahead. Welcome to What in the World is Going On?
This is What in the World is Going On. I'm your host, Richard Schaff. Our program is sponsored by Lincoln Log Homes. We are pro-Christian, pro-life, pro-Second Amendment, pro-American, here by the grace of God. Some of the information that I get for a daily reading service that I put out comes to me from Liberty Daily. It's that information that I use in preparation for my broadcasts on YouTube. This article that I want to share with you today, in the beginning of our program, is titled, "Is This the End of the Republic?" It is time for those who wish to end this pervasive leftist onslaught to get off the sidelines. We have a border crisis, an economic crisis, an energy crisis, a supply chain crisis, a health crisis, a crime wave, a labor shortage, inflation, and stranded Americans still in Afghanistan. All of these problems were not only preventable, but they were caused, created, worsened, aided and abetted by a man in the White House who's an ailing, doddering, senile, cognitively impaired buffoon who's spewing lies in incoherent sentences practically every time he speaks. When former President Trump left office in January, border crossings had been down for 8 consecutive months. But Joe Biden's refusal to enforce our border laws, including ending the successful Remain in Mexico policy, and his stopping the construction of the wall along our southern border, has resulted in the worst border crisis in at least 2 decades. In September 2021, U.S. Customs and Border Protection made over 192,000 apprehensions along our southern border. Border agents arrested more than 1.7 million illegal border crossings in the fiscal year that ended in September. This after 208,000 migrants illegally crossed our border in August, and 212,000 migrants entered the country in July. And these are just the numbers of those who came into custody. Overall, border apprehensions are up almost 500% over last year. But that's not all. We've handed control of Afghanistan to a bunch of barbarians that are really living in the Middle Ages. We watched helpless civilians fall from the sky, and 13 U.S. military members senselessly died. Hundreds of Americans were left stranded. $85 billion worth of weaponry and other military hardware was left behind, all for the Taliban. And the Biden administration lauded the debacle as a massive success. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the Secretary of State, the Secretary of Defense, and the National Security Advisor have more job security than unvaccinated police officers, firefighters, teachers, doctors, and nurses or flight attendants. We've got a federal government that is actively seeking to undermine the interests of the people of this country. It weaponizes the FBI to investigate parents who don't want their children to be indoctrinated with revisionist history and classifies them as, quote, domestic terrorists, end quote. A mere 48 hours before a judge ruled that a transgender teenager sexually assaulted a female student in Loudoun County up in Virginia, happened last May, former President Barack Obama said of outraged parents, and I'm quoting Obama, "We don't have time to be wasting on these phony, trumped-up cultural wars, this faked outrage that right-wing media peddles to juice their ratings." A quote from the former president. We have a vice president who was put in charge of immigration policy, put in charge of the fledgling Space Force, but who's instead AWOL on those tasks while lecturing us about equity, gender equality, climate change, the root cause of the immigration crisis, and participates in scripted theatrical events that make her come across as even more unlikable. We have a press secretary who's redefined the term, quote, gaslighting, and spins a web of misinformation and confusion while she condescendingly scoffs and smirks in the rare instance when she's asked legitimate questions. She gets a pass for circling back to protect her barely cognizant boss from a sympathetic press. We have big tech fast-checking. They want to censor the truth about Hunter's Biden corruption, deplatform Donald Trump, and limit freedom of expression while mainstreaming conspiracy theories and propaganda and assisting members of the Taliban and the Ayatollah in spewing their anti-American, anti-Israel propaganda. Little do they know that Trump's big tech exile has only increased his popularity. We've got a corrupt, deceitful, propagandist, spineless, socialistic corporate media that actively works to divide the country and advocates for every single position the ruling class in Washington tells us will save our country from going under. Even as one policy disaster after another piles up from this White House and the blue state governors, the Fourth Estate doubles down and tells us we need more of these experts to make decisions for us that will only further decimate our economy, create more lawlessness, increase poverty, and lower our standard of living. These economically illiterate Marxists tell us there's no reason why we shouldn't raise the debt limit and no way to overheat our failing economy. But they say we have plenty of room for unlimited socialist spending. They echo the fool in the Oval Office who tells us that $3.5 trillion costs $0, not $3.5 trillion. They tell us that taxing the hell out of billionaires, punishing job creators, and massive price increases in the form of gas, meat, poultry, appliances, and cars are not really a problem for working class Americans. We have a media that worked overtime to accuse Trump of being a Russian agent, a white supremacist inciting insurrection, and bearing responsibility for every single death from that Chinese virus, when all the while they ignored another president's eulogizing of a former Klansman, pay for play schemes, silence on Black Lives Matters and Antifa and their violence, scripted press conferences, incomprehensive ramblings, frailty, incapacitation, belligerence, culpability for creating the vaccine hesitancy, and intention to run our country into the ground. After a year and a half of COVID stupidity, the ruling class tells us everyone must continue walking around in face diapers, including those who are double and now triple vaxxed. They tell us that having to show proof of vaccination to eat at a restaurant or play in an NBA game or wear oxygen-sucking masks in school all day is the best way to defeat the virus, all the while shaming those who don't want to inject an experimental vaccine into their system. Anyone who refuses to obey the experts and their commandments must be shamed, persecuted, and humiliated, labeled a murderer, simpleton, rube, anti-vaxxer, and science denier. These well-credentialed coastal elites will tell us that. They tell us we must continue to go along with this charade by a doctor who never turns down an interview and who seems to be making it up as he goes along. You all know who I'm talking about there, don't you? They tell us not being allowed to go to the gym, open a business, or go to a house of worship, but being free to set a church on fire or smash windows, destroy property, loot, steal, burn the entire system to the ground. They tell us it's only healing for the country, but it'll foster a more perfect union. They tell us a war on cops and border patrol, but leniency on crime, lawlessness, and drugs makes us safer and more compassionate. They tell us with a straight face that open borders, more illegal immigration, and no more sovereign nation is a net positive for our country. They tell us we must be outraged and cancel comedians who make people laugh, that tell the truth, while promoting humorless woke activists, and they call it entertainment. They tell us we must refer to men as women and women as men. They tell us we better get used to supply chain crisis and empty shelves that resemble the 1970s Moscow, all the while the Transportation Secretary abrogates his duty for parental leave. They tell us weeks of early voting, days of post-election voting, no voter ID requirements, universal mail-in ballots, drop boxes, and less in-person voting is the safest, most secure way to conduct an election. They tell us the only cure to discrimination is more discrimination. They tell us teaching our children to hate our country, our founding principles, and their peers because of their skin color is just the kind of education we need to compete with the rest of the world. How much longer are we going to stand for this? And what is the remedy? You know there's no easy solution. But one thing is certain. It's time for those who wish to end this pervasive leftist onslaught to get off the sidelines. It's going to take more than Republicans in Congress and their ranting and raving on Fox News. It's going to take more than righteous anger at school board meetings. It'll take more than cops, nurses, teachers, and factory workers refusing to be vaccinated. It'll take all of those who wish to defend liberty and freedom against tyranny to insert ourselves into the arena and say, enough is enough. If we remain silent now, then it will be the end of our republic. 3 cheers for Virginia. Another piece of information I got came to me from Jeff Lewis, titled, America as Founded is Worth Fighting For. Ties right in here with what I just shared with you, plus what just happened in the recent election in the state of Virginia. America as Founded is worth fighting for. This is one of the resounding themes of this week's election results for Virginia's governor, lieutenant governor, attorney general, and both houses of the Virginia House of Delegates. The overwhelming victory of Republican candidates is a breath of fresh air in what we thought was a terminal march to the left's goal of the fundamental transformation of America and the ultimate suffocation of the freedoms we cherish. The canary can breathe again, and we're moving back to our source of life, the sweet smell of freedom. Now, don't misunderstand. There's still a lot of work to do, and we're just getting started. But I must be positive and optimistic because by listening to and watching the highlights of the corrupt state-controlled media's complete freakout, I can tell you they know they just lost big. They know there's been a tectonic, seismic shift in momentum for their ruinous agenda. They know that Senators Manchin and Sinema, along with who knows how many moderates or just plain scared Democrats, members of Congress, who know nothing but how to hold on to their swamp privilege, will now cover before the demonstrated power of the electorate and will not support the radical left's Marxist dreams. Patriots, gear up. In the words customarily attributed to that famous Virginian, Patrick Henry, now is the time for all good men to come to the aid of their country. Heard that many times, haven't we, fellow patriot? Take heart. This is a time for optimism because there's not a single thing the Democrat Party has supported for the past 18 months that survived last night's call referring to this week's election. From another source I got this week, a friend of mine, Marvin Rosenthal, I'm going to quote what he wrote. The greatest need in America today is national repentance. Without repenting of our sins, the United States will no longer experience the blessing of God as we have through much of history. As a nation, we must turn from our unrighteousness 180 degrees and seek to live righteously in accordance with God's directives. But the clock is ticking. We ourselves must live in the light of this reality and we must share this vital truth with family, friends, and loved ones while there is still time. And folks, that's where we are today. Do we have hope? Do I have hope? I have a lot more hope now than before this recent election. A personal note, it's going to be probably the week of November the 21st before my next broadcast. Not being cut off by anybody, just a matter within our internal organization here that it won't be available to send out for a couple of weeks. But I did want to repeat what I mentioned in our last broadcast. If you'd like to talk with me, Richard Schaaf, I'm the CEO of Lincoln Log Enterprises. I'll be happy to talk with you. If you want to talk about log homes, you have questions on them, I'll try to get you the answer. If you want to talk about this program or about America and our freedoms, I'll do that. My toll-free telephone number is 800-848-3310. Normally around the phones, from about 9 until 1 Eastern Time. If that's not good for you, call, leave a message anytime. We have an answering machine. I'll be happy. Leave me your name and number and a good time to call, and I'll try to get there at your convenience. If you want to order a log home, I'll put you in touch with one of our dealers, or if there's not a dealer in your area, I'll make you a price that'll blow your socks off. I'll let you buy dealer cost and a discount. 800-848-3310. In the meantime, continue to have hope. Continue to pray. Continue to run for office, whether it's city council or school board. There is hope for America. And one thing I've mentioned this several times. Remember this, good listener. If the lights of freedom go out in America, the light of freedom will go out around the world. God bless you until we're together again.